Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to the 8th edition of the O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Brown India Initiative and professor here at the Watson Institute and in the Department of Political Science. Let me start with a word about the genesis of these lectures. Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown Parents 2012, have endowed these lectures in perpetuity in memory of Mr. O.P. Jindal, Sajjan's deceased father. The purpose of the endowment is to promote a discussion of the politics, economics, society, and culture of contemporary India here at Brown. These lectures are held once every semester. The previous lecturers include Kaushik Basu, an economist at the World Bank, whose book based on his Jindal lectures was published last year by MIT Press. The other Jindal lecturers include Ram Guha, a historian, Ashish Nandi, a political psychologist, William Dalrymple, a literary figure and founder of the Jaipur Literary Festival, and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, a principal architect of India's economic reforms, post-91 economic reforms. Before I introduce the speaker and invite our dean to chair the proceedings, let me say a few words about the topic of the lecture. The topic is India's Muslims since independence. When the British left India in 1947, after nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule, there were nearly 100 million Muslims out of a total population of 400 million. That is to say, every 4th Indian was a Muslim in 1947. 35 million Muslims became citizens of India and 65 million citizens of Pakistan. According to the latest census, Indian census 2011, that is to say, Muslims were 13.4% of India's population. That's nearly 138 million. And needless to add, they are India's largest minority. It is also noteworthy that India's Muslims today, as in the past, are bimodal. That is to say, some among them are very rich, are very well-known film and sports stars, famous politicians and writers, bureaucrats, diplomats, and officers in the armed forces. But Muslims are also among the most economically disadvantaged communities of India. Indeed, only 2 communities, the Dalits and the tribal community, are more or less consistently lower on the economic scale. I can give you exact data on this, but this is the summary of a great deal of statistical work on the subject. Why is this so? Why are most Muslims are not better off? I'm not sure whether our speaker, Salman Khurshid, will address this question, but whatever he wishes to speak on, it's clear that few Indians are better placed to answer these questions than our speaker today. Salman Khurshid was born after India's independence in 1953. He grew up in India, and after taking a bachelor's degree from St. Stephen's College, studied law at Oxford, where he also subsequently taught law. Since his return from Oxford, he has combined 3 careers in India: politics, law, and writing. He is a Congress Party politician, and his last assignment was as India's Minister for External Affairs, which, as you know, is equivalent to the US Secretary of State. His writings include a famous book that I read long ago, At Home in India, first published in 1987 and reissued last year, a play entitled Sons of Babur, the first Mughal emperor of India, Babur, and a book, The Other Side of the Mountain, published last year. The other books also, I'm just listing 3 for you. Our Dean of Faculty, Kevin McLaughlin, will chair the proceedings. In addition to being our Dean, he's the George Hazard, am I pronouncing it correctly? Croker University Professor of English, Professor of Comparative Literature, and Professor of German Studies. Over the last 5 years, he's been a great supporter of the India Initiative that We've been in existence for 5 years, and he's attended several of our events. With appreciation for his support, let me now invite Kevin to open and chair the proceedings. Kevin.
Thank you, Ashu. It's a pleasure to be able, on behalf of Brown University, to welcome Mr. Khurshid to Brown University. As you all know, we are committed to making our university an international leader for the study of India and South Asia in all of its complex splendor. At this juncture, as the initiative begins to emerge as a cutting-edge interdisciplinary center at the Watson Institute, it is fitting to greet here such a cosmopolitan intellectual and political leader who has stood especially consistently for ecumenism and tolerance. It's also a privilege to have him here to share his firsthand experience of the advances and challenges of Indian democracy. In the context of students and others protesting for racial, ethnic, and religious inclusion in contemporary India, as well as in the United States and around the world, we are fortunate to have Mr. Khurshid with us for a few days at Brown, and I'd like to thank him on behalf of the university warmly for agreeing to speak to us today about important topics facing his country and the world. Thank you, Mr. Khurshid.
Good evening to you all. I'm very grateful that my good friend Dr. Varshney and Dean Kevin McLaughlin has given me this opportunity to be here at Brown University for the second time, and that too for the O.P. Jindal lecture instituted by my good friend Sajjan Jindal. It's a great honor really to be here in tribute to someone who is part of the Indian landscape of growth, prosperity, and optimism about where we were going. But the topic that's been given to me is a topic that I'm afraid, despite my best efforts, is going to be a little less optimistic, and would raise some genuine and honest concerns that are being felt in our country today. As I say this, I'm conscious also of the fact that every time someone like me speaks at a university abroad, in the atmosphere that we are accustomed to, atmosphere of free speech, atmosphere of free exchange of ideas, and willingness to be critical of one's own surroundings, is something that, for some reason, in contemporary India is unacceptable. The Dean referred to what is happening in Indian universities for a variety of reasons, and has been given some specific labels. But the fact remains that there is a problem about freedom of speech. Who is concerned, who is causing it, who is instigating or provoking action against people who want to express themselves freely is entirely another matter. But the worrisome thing, and I think a dangerous thing and dangerous development in our country, is that the very institution that should be standing up in defense of freedom of speech is the institution that seems, at present at least, inclined to stifle freedom of speech, and that's the Indian electronic media. And I have often been at the receiving end of the attacks of the Indian media by speaking my mind freely at universities outside the country. For some reason, they believe that even if you want to be critical of affairs at home, you have no right to be critical of those affairs outside India's territory. Be that as may, if you come to Brown University, you have to be honest, you have to be candid, you have to be transparent, and you have to leave behind, hopefully, something that you find useful rather than merely mouthed phrases and and good intentions. Looking at the passage of India's Muslims from what is really not too distant a date, the time of our independence, to present times, one cannot but mention in passing the relationship that has existed of the whole world to the Muslim world over time. Going back to the theological and religious differences that arose out of the birth of the very religion of Islam during the life of the Holy Prophet, and how that was seen as a challenge to a continuum that had passed before Islam came to the Arabian Peninsula, which is the religions that we were familiar with, although are described as religions of the book, and therefore an accepted theological continuation from Judaism to Christianity and from Christianity to Islam. Yet we find that over the centuries there was reason for conflict and confrontation that sometimes became extremely unfortunate and ugly. And of course, it manifested itself in many ways. It first manifested itself in the Crusades that went on for several centuries. It then saw a second manifestation in the confrontation between the West and the Ottoman Empire and the World Wars, and the consequences left behind by the World Wars, which to this day we see in terms of what is happening in Palestine. The third real confrontation, as it were, or association between the West and the Islamic world came when the oil-rich Arab countries began to influence economic decisions of the world. But the final phase, of course, as we've seen of late, is the phase of regime changes, the consequences of that, and of course the parallel unfortunate and unwholesome development described variously as extremism, jihadist Islam, or indeed a revival of antagonism of a kind that perhaps hasn't been known since the Crusades. In India too, there were similar phases. The first phase, of course, was the reaction to the fading of the Mughal Empire that had ruled India for over 200 years. The last Mughal king, Bahadur Shah Zafar, being exiled by the British to a way off place in Rangoon. A dynasty that had first been seen as an invading outsider, alien, but then became a part and parcel, as it were, of the Indian ethos and Indian consciousness when Bahadur Shah Zafar was seen as the first and foremost freedom fighter behind whom all forces of freedom rallied in an unsuccessful attempt at what we call the First War of Independence, but the British call the Great Indian Mutiny. 90 years later, of course, we were to get our independence in 1947. But independence came with partition, a partition that, to the best of our effort, the so-called patriots of our country did not succeed beyond the point. The partition did take place. Jinnah starting off as a Congress leader, but then moving out and advocating the birth of Pakistan, was successful in establishing what he called was the Islamic State, both in the West and the East. In the West, what is now Pakistan, and in the East, what is now Bangladesh, repudiated and rejected firmly by those who opted and chose to stay back in India, including the vast number of Muslims that Professor Varshney just mentioned. Less than what Pakistan took away, but still a significant size of Muslims who consciously decided to stay back in India. But at the same time, we must keep in mind that the same figures have now changed because Pakistan has ended up with less Muslims than India has, and yet calls itself a Muslim country after the breakup of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan. Partition came with an enormous price, at an enormous cost for Muslims. Huge and great violence took place in North India. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of property was lost. And as a result of a truncated society, as a result of an extremely violent partition, there was an element of self-consciousness amongst Muslims. So Muslims not only became self-conscious of the charge that they were responsible for partition of the country, which they were not, and at the same time having lost, if my understanding is correct, although there is some research which suggests that that's not entirely true, that the elite of Muslim society after partition or at the time of partition moved to Pakistan, and therefore it was a truncated, leaderless society that was left behind. You can think of any leader who had, in a sense, inspired Muslims before partition. We lost those leaders. We lost leaders like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who, perforce to stay with his own people, had to accept partition very unwillingly, and therefore became a thorn in the side of the government of Pakistan, but had to leave India. And all that we were left was with Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who worked very closely with Nehru, but had very little political base of his own. And Nehru had to, in fact, support him and find him a political constituency that he could succeed from so that he could remain relevant to the political process. Maulana Azad made a remarkable speech. I think that those students of Indian political history will be aware of. He made this wonderful speech, a remarkable speech at the footsteps of Jama Masjid, where he appealed to the people of the Muslims of India to accept a new reality and forget about their past. As this moved forward, Pakistan, uncertain steps, shaky steps that Pakistan took towards consolidation of its own national enterprise, obviously rudely hurt by what happened with the early demise of Jinnah, the assassinations, and of course the subsequent military takeovers. So Pakistan never really stabilized as the nation that they had aspired to be. Truncation of Pakistan through the breakup of Pakistan and Bangladesh caused further damage to them. But in any case, Pakistan was never seen as a role model by Indian Muslims. Indian Muslims, perhaps out of abundance of caution, except a few fringe elements, young fringe elements at that time. And there is an explanation of why some young Indian Muslims would have continued to relate with Pakistan, and you hear stories about young Indian Muslims provoking violence against themselves by celebrating a victory of a Pakistani cricket team, or shouting slogans which suggested that they were less patriotic than the rest of their countrymen. But it happened largely because a lot of the families were divided, and people forget that a lot of Indian Muslim families were so divided that one brother would be in India and another brother or a sister would be in Pakistan, that somebody would get married to someone in Pakistan, particularly Indian girls, Muslim girls would get married to young men in Pakistan, and therefore could not break away entirely emotionally from their families that were left behind. But because of successive wars between India and Pakistan, the families were pulled asunder, and they were seldom able to meet. Very tough visa regimes which didn't allow them to meet, including people right at the top, people who made it to high office in our country, had become extremely self-conscious and therefore would not even imagine or hope against hope that they would be able to see their relatives from Pakistan. Nevertheless, Nehru, with people like Maulana Azad, stood firm in ensuring that a clear message of support and solidarity went out to Muslims. But I believe, and this is an untested thesis, but it's something that's worth examining, when India sat down to work an arrangement for its future structure, there was a serious issue about the untouchables of the past, people to whom Mahatma Gandhi had devoted and dedicated a huge part of his life. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi was the one who gave them the title or the name of Harijans, the children of God, which today, in fact, has become again a word of connotations that are not acceptable or wholesome, and therefore the same people today are called Dalits. Dalits it's a little bit like the American vocabulary on African American black culture, times when calling black people black was not such a good thing, times when the black people demanded that they be called black. In a similar manner, the Dalits have gone from untouchables to Harijans, from Harijans to Dalits, and in common parlance often referred to as SCs or scheduled castes in the constitutional language we have. But when at that time we sat down to do our constitutional arrangement, and this remained a very high priority for the constitutional structure, the ones who suffered the most were Muslims, because they were not willing to seek special privileges for themselves, in the fear that we would once again give an impression of sounding as though we wanted another partition of India beyond 1947. And therefore, what was then might perhaps have been necessary, and as Professor Varshney says, there is ample evidence available that Muslims were and remain extremely backward and disadvantaged, in many cases even worse off than Dalits, because Dalits have had the advantage of reservations for several decades. Muslims remain greatly disadvantaged, and therefore perhaps at that time would have sought and ought to have sought some special affirmative action privileges or claims and rights that they didn't because of the self-consciousness. So there was, post-independence, for at least 20 to 25 years, some degree of self-consciousness which made Muslims into a passive, pushed them into a passive existence, with very little emergence in terms of leadership of their own, looking towards Nehru, looking towards the main Congress leaders as being their last resort, and not really hoping to have their own leaders emerge, not necessarily respecting, but not necessarily aggressively supporting their own leadership like Maulana Azad or Rafi Ahmed Kadwai or Dr. Ibrahim and other Muslims that might have followed. But 2 or 3 decades down the road, the dust of partition began to settle, and the Muslim culture, Muslim capacity began to reassert itself, and they did so in various fields, came into sports, came into Bollywood, into the world of film, world of art and culture. The best artists, the best performers as far as sitar and various vocal singers, and certainly the best actors in the country came from amongst Muslims, and the artisans. And altogether, Muslims became less self-conscious and began with greater participation in the nation-building project, if I could call that. We began to see, with I think a significant amount of interest shown by Nehru and his team, we began to see the emergence of Muslim faces in important positions, which during the time of Indira Gandhi went up to the President of India, my grandfather, when he was elected the third President of India, against advice that she received from large number of senior Congress leaders that she would wreck her career by backing him as president. Nobody could at that time think of a Muslim president of India. Now we've had three, and we've had a Sikh president, and we've had a Dalit president. But at that time, you couldn't imagine a Muslim becoming president. It was a little bit like President John Kennedy, the first time that person of a particular persuasion was thought of as a president of the United States of America. Still haven't been able to break the glass ceiling as far as a lady president is concerned. You might do it in the coming times, but India has at least broken the glass ceiling of a lady president. But the emergence of faces at the highest level, Chief of Staff, Chief Justice of India, the President of India, few and far between, but significantly important, symbolic and substantive positions that Muslims began to hold. There are some interesting stories about how circulars preventing Muslims from taking sensitive positions in government were circulated in government of India under Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. A lot of people believe because despite his very clear secular credentials, he wasn't able to control his government and to the same extent. And as somebody has reported his conversation saying, the most difficult thing about India is to run a secular administration in what is essentially a highly religious society. And I think those are the contradictions and inherent conflicts that he faced in his life, very, very clearly, remaining throughout his life as somebody in whom Muslims had great trust and faith, and there wasn't at all at any stage a question mark. Something that his daughter Indira Gandhi lost at times in some cases because Indian society became more difficult to handle. A lot of very severe riots that happened during the time of Indira Gandhi became a major issue and continued to be an issue for a long time. And why these riots were happening, I think there isn't a better exposition of this in the work than the work of Professor Varshney himself. How regeneration and growth of Muslim prosperity became itself a challenge and a provocation to those who were unhappy about it. How integration of institutions, public institutions, perforce in some cities ensured that there were no riots, and how the lack of that integration in some cities caused a repetition of riots over a period. But riots became a big issue in those times. Security became the big issue in those times under Indira Gandhi. And despite her best efforts, India, because of the tensions of a federal structure, India, because of increasing conflicts in the process of growth, and for a variety of other reasons, was unable to provide the kind of security that any minority considers to be its highest priority. There were, at that time also, emerging certain other issues. One important issue that emerged was seen as an extremely important imperative for the Muslim community, and that was the character and preservation of the character of Aligarh Muslim University. Very early on after independence, the Supreme Court of the country had held that Aligarh Muslim University is not a minority university. Let me explain what that means. That the minority institutions established by the minorities of our country, linguistic or religious, have special protection against state interference. Something that is now becoming a little illusory, because the Supreme Court, in a judgment in more recent years of 11 judges, has said that the state has no business to interfere in universities. And it will probably is something that will come once again to the Supreme Court when what is happening in universities today in India is tested against the 11 judges' judgment about non-interference in the atmosphere and the structures of universities. But the time when Aligarh's case was decided, there was a clear division between what could be done in universities set up by the state and what could not be done in universities set up by the minority communities under Article 30 of the Constitution. But the Supreme Court said, this is not a university set up by the minority, this is a university set up by an Act of Parliament. And an Act of Parliament setting up a university means that university is a state university, it can't be called a minority university, and therefore it can't get protection or Article 30. So de facto, Aligarh remained protected. Aligarh has never had a non-Muslim vice-chancellor. Aligarh hasn't been able to change its name from Aligarh Muslim University to Aligarh State University. But the de jure protection that Aligarh sought could not be given. And that matter is again before the Supreme Court and perhaps will be looked at in the next 3 months. And it is again before the Supreme Court because Indira Gandhi, when she came under pressure and the question marks began to loom large about her ability to have the same relationship with Muslims that her father had, began to do some specific things to reach out to them. One was the Aligarh University Amendment Act, which has recently by the courts been struck down. It continued for 25 years. It's been struck down by the Allahabad High Court and now will be decided upon in the Supreme Court once again. She also set up a high-powered committee called the Gopal Singh Committee to address this whole business about security. She also set up a very important committee on the language, on Urdu language, called the I.K. Gujral Committee, a gentleman who then went on to become Prime Minister many years later after he had left the Congress Party. These committees, these recommendations, these suggestions, and these steps that were taken were steps to reach out to Muslims, to give them a sense of security, and to give them a clear sense that the intent of solidarity with them for having reposed their faith in a unified India was something that would not be dissipated by the government under Indira Gandhi. But unfortunately, we lost her. And we lost her to something that emerged suddenly, and it outstripped any sense of disquiet that the Muslims may have felt, and that was the Sikh extremism from Punjab. It came suddenly, it blew up, it became an explosion, and it ended up taking Indira Gandhi's life and indeed leaving a deep scar on the Indian psyche that remains today a troublesome scar, despite all the years that have gone by. But that's only a side story of the disquiet and dissent of a minority community. Otherwise, Sikhs were never really in the same position as Muslims. No issue about not being able to get into the armed forces, no issue about not being able to get into the police forces, no issue about any secret circulars saying they must be kept away from sensitive positions and so on, and no real issues about poverty, no real issues about not being able to participate in life, and fortunately for them, at least having one state in which they were in a near majority, unlike Muslims who are not in a majority anywhere except in Jammu and Kashmir. So although Muslims continue to feel that sense of disquiet and uncertainty, and as I said, Indira Gandhi tried to address it in a significant way, the impact of that could not really be felt because she was then distracted by the developments in Sikh politics. She lost her life, and then her young son took over as prime minister, and tried to deal with that problem with as much acumen as was available, and energy as he could inject. But unfortunately, two terrible things happened. One was a case that continues to befuddle thinkers to this day, and that was the case of Shah Bano, where an Indian woman, a Muslim woman, sought relief from the courts for maintenance under the ordinary criminal law, where maintenance of a very small amount is granted to parents whose children don't support them, or a divorced wife or a wife who is unable to support herself, and the husband refuses to do so. The amount that she was granted was something like 32 rupees. Matter went all the way to the Supreme Court because it was seen by Muslims as an interference in their personal law. The personal law saying that there is, after divorce, no relationship between man and woman. Whatever has to happen must happen within the duration of the marriage, and after that there is no question of anyone taking or giving anything. Really, it was a non-issue, but it became a huge explosive issue between those who wanted to teach Muslims a lesson, those who were genuinely concerned about gender equality and parity, and those who were somehow feeling threatened that this would be opening of floodgates against the entire Islamic ethos. So the end result was that Rajiv Gandhi was pressured into bringing about legislation to undo what the Supreme Court had done, and therefore the Muslim Women's Protection on Divorce Act was passed. Curiously, that act went back to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Thank you very much, you've done exactly what we had said in our judgment." So the Supreme Court reinterpreted the act as though it had consolidated what they had done in their judgment. Since then, the Personal Law Board or any Muslim or anybody else has not challenged it. But the issue of personal law remains. Can the Supreme Court interfere in personal law? And in which kind of personal law can the Supreme Court interfere? There is a Christian judge of late who suggested, because of adoption issues, just before retirement, Justice Vikramjit Sen said that there is now time has come for us to review to the extent to which personal law should be allowed to stand, where the Constitution should prevail. And similarly, now there is a triple divorce matter which is before the Supreme Court, where again this issue about whether the Constitution should prevail or some interpretation of personal law should prevail. I say this has been a non-issue because in real terms, there is no conflict. There was an imagined conflict, and in an imagined conflict, two positions, one conservative and one progressive, seemed to contradict each other. And the end result, of course, was that in a very divided country, an impression was given out that Rajiv Gandhi was an ultra-conservative prime minister trying to appease the feelings of the Muslims. Then came the restriction that was imposed on the import of Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verses, that added. And then as the pressure grew, somebody, it seems, suggested that this pressure could be eased by doing something in Ayodhya that would, in a sense, even out the playfield. And that was to open the locks in this old Babri Masjid, a disputed spot where some people believed there was a temple built to commemorate the birth of Lord Ram, but a temple that was then destroyed by a general of the Mughal army, and on which spot masjid was built. Since soon after independence, the structure, the building was lying locked under the ordinary criminal law. Suddenly it was open, and people believe it couldn't have been opened by a magistrate on a whim. It must have been because of some encouragement of the government. The locks were opened, worshippers were flocked and started worshipping. And that became a major issue of betrayal. We haven't to this day solved that problem. Because from there it led to the movement, to the actual demolition. By the time there wasn't, Rajiv Gandhi was gone, but Narasimha Rao was there. And the second big betrayal is supposed to have happened with the demolition of the Ram Temple or Babri Masjid, whatever you call it. And the matters remain there. They were sent off to the High Court to be heard by 3 judges. 3 judges gave incomprehensible judgments and finally said, just make three parts of this land, give one to the Akhara, give one to the Ram Temple movement, and give one part of it to the masjid. Completely without precedent, completely without legal basis. They just thought this was the best way to solve the problem. Matter now lies in the Supreme Court. But when all this happened, and huge violence broke out and riots happened in the country, it was felt at that time that the only way to solve this problem is that by Muslims, that they should drift to those parties that were prepared to speak for them. And so Muslims drifted away to Mulayam Singh Yadav, to Mayawati, to Lalu, to Nitish Kumar, etc. And new parties emerged that took over politics in northern India. And these were parties that only took Muslim votes but never gave Muslims anything else. They couldn't even solve any of the problems because of which Muslims had drifted to them. But Muslims became virtual captives of these parties. And Congress obviously began losing. And the losing streak of the Congress began. BJP came to power once, but then lost, went out of power again. Congress was uncertain, but then Congress was able to claw back, at least in the urban areas, the more enlightened and more thinking Muslims back to the Congress. And as a result, Congress formed UPA 1 and UPA 2 under Dr. Manmohan Singh. One very critical thing that Dr. Manmohan Singh did was that he set up one committee called the Sachar Committee and one commission called the Rangnath Mishra Commission. For the first time since independence, Muslims were referred to as Muslims and not as a minority. In the past, whenever governments wanted to speak about Muslims, they would refer to them as a minority, not as Muslims. The idea being that you don't highlight the Muslim identity and invite unnecessary hostility. So you speak of them in more general terms of minorities, although in minorities what really mattered throughout, either for political reasons or in terms of numbers or in terms of influence in election, was really the Muslim vote, who were about 85% or more of the total minority population. There were Sikhs, there were Christians, there were Buddhists, but not more than 2% Sikhs, not more than 1% Christians, not more than 0.5% of Buddhists, but at least 10% Muslims. Now, as you say, they're about 13% Muslims. Nevertheless, they were referred to as minority. For the first time, when Sachar Committee was set up, Muslims were referred to as Muslims. And Sachar was asked to find out whether Muslims were really disadvantaged and backward. And that's what Sachar did. Sachar collected information, put that information together, and then very categorically and in great candor said, Muslims are extremely backward, extremely disadvantaged, and therefore something needs to be done. And they made recommendations of what could be done. So did the Rangnath Mishra Commission. And essentially the recommendations that were made were that you've got to do something about education, once again, which is give them schools, give them scholarships, and a huge scholarship program was unleashed for Muslims. But more than that, build up infrastructure in areas where Muslims live. So Muslim concentrated districts, about 90 of them, or minority concentrated districts, about 4 or 5 or 6 were Christian dominated. 1 or 2 were Sikh dominated. and largely Muslim-dominated districts were given huge amount of funding to set up infrastructure, schools, road, drinking water, colleges, etc. The idea being that you build up those areas, not necessarily give things to Muslims, but give them to the local population and let the entire population benefit from it under the schemes where they would know that they are getting this benefit because of the Muslim population and therefore would participate in those benefits coming to everybody. There was also a decision that a lot of funding from banks and financial institutions would be given to minorities. There was also a decision about reservations for minorities. Those are the areas that became very, very dicey and became very, very contentious. Reservations are being given in our country to Dalits, 22%, approved by the Supreme Court. Reservations are given 27% to those who are like Dalits but not Dalits, called OBCs or other backward classes. People often think that OBCs are other backward castes because there are no other backward groups under the present regime except those that are backward castes. But castes are not permissible in the constitutional framework. Therefore, they are all called backward classes, OBCs. 27% of them under Mandal are given backwards. Now, more and more people want to become backwards because they want those benefits. And more backwards want to become Dalits because they want the benefits of Dalits. So the very purpose for which we had launched affirmative action, to bring people above the disadvantaged position that they had and bring them into the mainstream so that they could compete on equal terms, has today been defeated by everybody saying we don't want to compete on equal terms. So there is no single community that's been excluded in more than 50 years from the list of backwards, whereas there are several communities that have been included and more communities are harping and screaming to be included. But what we did is that we recommended, on the basis of Sachar Committee and Rangnath Mishra, that out of the 22% reservations that are given to backward communities, the backwards amongst Muslims / minorities would be given a sub-quota of 4%. Election Commission went wild when we made this announcement. They went absolutely crazy saying you're using religion to propagate politics. And this happened during UP elections, and there was a huge controversy. Then the matters were put to test in the Andhra Pradesh High Court, and Andhra Pradesh High Court said you can't rely upon religion and give 4%. Now, it was a strange thing that the same 4% would be covered in 27 on the same reason and grounds that they were in 27. They were being given a sub-quota of 4% to be equitable, but the court said, no, you can't do this. So if somebody was, say, a person who worked with leather and he was a Hindu, he would have reservations. But somebody who worked with leather and was a Muslim initially didn't have reservations, finally was included in reservations, but because the Hindu was better off than him and was more likely to get the jobs or the benefits that were given in reservations, therefore, Sachar and Rangnath Mishra suggested that to the extent of the population of the Muslim who is backward, carve out 4% out of 22 and give it to him. But the court in Andhra Pradesh, 7 judges together said this is not to be done. That matter is also now before the Supreme Court and has to be decided. Now, Muslims felt that we had cheated them, that we had deliberately done these things in a manner in which they would be struck down by courts, and there was never any intention to help them. And this was our tragedy. This was the tragedy, and when I say our tragedy, it was our tragedy in terms of our party politics, but it was also the tragedy of Indian society, that there was a huge chunk and population that felt that they had been let down, and the promises that had been made to them were actually hollow. There was no intention or sincerity to implement those promises. And that is the reason why, for the second time, Muslims decided that they wanted to go and support other political parties who obviously had no intention of delivering anything to them, but kept saying, we are not at the center, therefore we can't deliver. If we ever come to the center, we will deliver, and somehow managed to wean away Muslims. But that was not enough. Smaller parties, fragmented parties began to emerge in North India, and parties with the names like Peace Party and Muslim MIM called the Ittihad-e-Muslimin, which is led by a man called Owaisi in Hyderabad. Then there were some priests who put together another party in parts of UP, and lots of little Muslim parties emerged. And they felt that just as Mayawati had succeeded as a Dalit party, and Mulayam had succeeded as a Yadav party, and Lalu had succeeded as a Yadav party, they could also succeed as Muslim parties. The trouble, of course, is the moment a Muslim party emerges, immediately the horror of partition emerges as well. And therefore, all you get is what is called polarization, that all Hindus move towards one side and all Muslims move towards one side. What happened when a large-scale movement, such a movement happened, is that we gave birth to an unimaginable thing, which is the present government. Well, I'm not saying anything more because they'll tear me to pieces when I go home. But I just want to remind you of...
You shouldn't be afraid. You're being live streamed.
I'm being live streamed. So, well, if Arnab is listening, I can just say to him that I'll be back in 3 days. And then, unfortunately, the Congress is boycotting his program, so he'll just have to manage with an empty chair. This is where we stand. The biggest failure of my government, or the government to which I belong, the biggest failure was our inability to bring about consensus on a remarkable recommendation that had been made by Sachar, and that was the Equal Opportunity Commission. You in your country have a very, very small area that is covered by Equal Opportunity Commission. The rest, non-discrimination clauses, etc., equal treatment, and so on, comes through courts. We also have equal treatment through courts, Article 14, Article 16, etc., Article 19 and 21. But the idea was that instead of religion, seemingly religion-specific, or caste-specific, seemingly caste-specific affirmative action, we could do affirmative action where a larger inclusivity would protect and would become a barrier to the charge of appeasement. But unfortunately, because we have 12 commissions, the Women's Commission, the Minority Commission, the Untouchables Commission, the Touchable Commission, the Children's Commission, we have 12 commissions who felt their jobs would go. And therefore, everybody and their ministers opposed the idea of Equal Opportunity Commission. And the biggest idea, I think, that was born during the UPA 1 and was to be implemented in UPA 2, which would be the greatest game changer for the way India dealt with social justice in the years to come and decades to come, was unfortunately dumped. And I was told by a colleague of mine that Equal Opportunity Commission has come out of the report on Muslims' disadvantage. Therefore, Equal Opportunity Commission should be equal opportunity for Muslims and for no others. Now, I couldn't think of a worse way of killing Equal Opportunity Commission than that. Therefore, I quickly surrendered and I said, let's not have any more discussions. Very quickly, I just want to say that after the Equal Opportunities Commission was lost, as I said, the drift and the polarization happened. We lost the elections. And I will read to you very quickly, because this would require a whole week of lectures, as to what is the position where we stand today. 30 years ago, when I was a young lawyer, I attempted that book that you've just mentioned, At Home in India. And when I recently sat down to update that book, I discovered that not a single issue that I had mentioned 30 years ago has been resolved or has disappeared. All those issues remain, and they're now being re-agitated in a very virulent manner. So really it seems like time has stood still for Muslims in India. But there is a silver lining, and I want to emphasize the silver lining. It's very important that even as the so-called jihadi clouds of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan region have left a dark shadow in a large part of the Middle East, none of these have fortunately floated towards the subcontinent. We cannot, of course, remain impervious to these dark shadows, but we have to be careful not to do anything to invite these shadows onto our land. The Muslim experiment in India, despite some short-sighted failings that have considerably undermined the ability of Indian Muslims of contributing a glorious character to social history of world religions, has much to teach to the troubled world of Islam in our times. The question, of course, is whether they can rise to the challenge by grasping enlightened leadership that might draw them out of their miseries at home and show the path to Muslims elsewhere in the world. But that to be possible, the incumbent government of India will have to understand that they'll have to understand the Muslims of India. In doing so, the government has indeed the people generally, will have to dispassionately examine why Muslims and other minorities are sensitive about interference with their personal law, why Babri Masjid remains an important issue of rule of law as well as freedom of worship. Reservations cannot be seen as a legitimate instrument of social change if they take help from caste but arbitrarily use religion to exclude Muslims. That Aligarh Muslim University and Jamia Millia Islamia are part of a constitutional guarantee that must not be frustrated by hyper-technical arguments. That beef-eating prohibition cannot be given over to vigilante justice, articulately, particularly as many states permit the sale of beef. The homecoming or ghar wapsi and exaggerated forms of nationalism such as compulsory reciting of Bharat Mata Ki Jai or Glory to Mother India, using fight against terrorism for political aims, devious use of the adage that every Muslim is not a terrorist, but every terrorist is a Muslim, and expressing the indignation at the use of saffron terror label for stifling all rational questioning of agents provocateurs. The politico-cultural shift in politics of exclusion and alienation as a party political strategy to change the electoral landscape permanently since 2014 election has become a battleground for Indians across society who worry about living in a regimented and conservative religious society, or what is described by some as Talibanization of India. Fortunately, the base of Indian thought is so profoundly inclusive and tolerant, as indeed it is truly democratic, that transitory shifts of power are unlikely to overwhelm it. Muslims are sensibly letting others take the lead in this campaign to preserve and protect India's secular culture. The real test for upholding of diversity might be to depart from the word secular that has been whipped beyond recognition by right-wing activists and turn to the word liberal that will have less baggage of communal arguments to carry. And let the word go forth from this time and place alike that the liberals of the world should unite. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll take some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, Nazira.
Thank you very much. That was a really enlightening historical narrative of the Muslim predicament before and after partition, and also placing it in a sort of global historical context. Now, the Muslim predicament has often been compared to the Jewish predicament in Europe, the Muslim predicament in India, the Jewish minority question in Europe. But in some ways, your talk opened up to a different comparison, maybe set in motion by Karen's opening remarks. We're thinking about the African American history in the U.S. and thinking about Muslim struggles in India. In some sense, one of the things that's come forward with Black Lives Matter and the mobilizations here is that despite winning civil rights, despite attempts at affirmative action, racism has had an entrenched place institutionally, and that there is something systematic about racism. There are those who benefit from racism that need to be taken into account as much as those who experience both the exclusion and the violence from it. And I wonder if in your narrative you might think about whether the systematic nature, if there's something systematic also about the Muslim experience of exclusion in India. If one, rather than episodic, right, this happened, that happened, which is a historian's narrative as well. This happened and that happened, but rather to think about, is there something systematic, and whether one of the things that one could argue has been changing, and if one uses your benchmark of Indira Gandhi era, the end of the Indira Gandhi era, inaugurating a new sort of phase in Indian history, of thinking about ways in which prejudice against Muslims, stereotypes about Muslims, fear of Muslims, has circulated, proliferated, which are all sort of ways in which one could argue the institutional ways in which, so even though Nehru might be, like even if leaders might be secular, there's ways in which prejudice and works institutionally in complex ways, and something we're grappling with very profoundly here at Brown. So I think that comparison from may push you to think about this.
Could I add to this? Those who've thought a great deal about whether the Muslim predicament in India is similar to the African American predicament in the United States have also proposed that the more exact comparison would be of Dalits in India and African Americans in the United States, not Muslims in India and African Americans in the United States, for the simple reason that the Muslim socio-economic situation is bimodal. That there are film stars and there are sports stars and there are people in the armed forces of late. There are Muslims who've led the Air Force, as you called attention to. There have been fairly rich Muslims. But Dalits have never seen, until the last 5-6 years or so, any affluence at all. It's not bimodal, it's unimodal. Everybody was at the bottom of the hierarchy, as African Americans were historically or until recently. Now, how would you, so Wazira's point is that African American predicament and Muslim predicament have a great deal of similarity in that there is systematic institutional prejudice. Regardless of who becomes president, whether it's African American Barack Obama or 3 Muslim presidents of India, including your grandfather, Mr. Zakir Hussain, so you can see that the way this analytic terrain is set up, that Dalit situation is more similar to African American situation, and there is institutional and systematic prejudice in India against Dalits, as it is against Muslims, but there is a certain segment of Muslims, which would include you, there is a certain segment of Muslims which have been rather privileged, and Dalits have never been. So Chandrabhan Prasad, my friend, says that there's never been a Dalit film star, so he says it's worse than African American. There's never been a Dalit film star, there's never been a Dalit sports star. Never. He says not even one. So how would you incorporate what Wazira is saying, what those of us who've thought about it, who come out this way, right? What would you say to us?
Well, I think if I may be allowed to say so, I agree with you, and I agree with the lady as well, for this reason, that the sense of discrimination that exists in society here, as it would have existed in Europe vis-a-vis the Jews before the war and during the war, and the sense that we have about discrimination against African Americans is similar to the sense we have about Dalits in India. And statistically, of course, I think it would be correct to say that there are heights that have been touched by Muslims that have in various fields that have not been touched by Dalits at all, which is correct, except that we've had a Dalit Chief Justice, we've had a Dalit President, we've had very important Dalit ministers. The Home Ministry has been with Dalits, and it seems that in giving Dalit high office, there is never a contrary view. Whereas in giving a Muslim high office, there are always question marks that are raised. The kind of support that across the board, across political parties, youngsters in the universities have been able to get off late, who are Dalit youngsters, would not have been possible for a Muslim youth in our universities. Because there is always an element of self-consciousness that is injected. Either it's already there or it's injected every time a Muslim is talked about, which is not the case for Dalits. But Dalits started off much worse. I mean, that's obviously the same as the African Americans have suffered. That they started off much worse because of the humiliation that was inflicted upon them and the exploitation that they suffered and probably continue to suffer to this day. We hear some horrendous stories even to this day, despite the fact that there are Dalits who are in government. But an important difference is the reservation issue. If you look at government officials, at certain levels of government officials, there's a proliferation of Dalits. And the emergence of Mayawati's party through DS4 happened because there were these officials who were in important positions, judges at trial court level, magistrates, section officers, junior officers, IAS officers, IPS officers, who not only gave them the muscle of administrative support, but also contributed enormously to their cash reserves and created this party. And this party now is a very significant party to deal with. So I think there are some elements that are common. There's some elements that are entirely and completely different. And the ultimate irony lies in the fact that nobody would ever dare to question any politician who stands up and says, we need to do more for Dalits and give them more jobs and more reservations. Nobody would ever dare to do that. I was questioned in an election speech because I said Muslims have a right of 4% reservations that the government is giving. And it was a Muslim election commissioner who questioned me during the election campaign. So that's the difference. Nobody can now question a Dalit in our country. Nobody.
Except that people point out that what is called systematic racism.
That's
Systematic prejudice. Here is called systematic or institutional racism. Systematic prejudice. So, for example, if the Dalit student clashed with a Hindu nationalist student organization, he ended up committing suicide.
Yeah.
No one was there to protect him. A great deal came out. A great many people came out in support. But the way the prejudice worked led to this bright student who wanted to be like Carl Sagan, or wanted to be a scientist like Carl Sagan. he ended up committing suicide because he saw absolutely
No, I agree.
details.
That's
So there's institutional
it's
prejudice,
there.
right? Yeah.
Institutional prejudice is there. The fact that they can't get into temples even now is there. The fact that Dalit women are exploited in rural areas, it's there. But when you have a national discussion or national discourse about somebody who has suffered, nobody dare what they're doing to the former Finance and Home Minister P. Chidambaram about affidavits that he had filed in a case of a fake encounter of Ishrat Jahan, right? Chidambaram today is being accused of being hand in glove with terrorists because he happened to do his justice involving a Muslim. If the same thing had happened regarding a Dalit, there would not be a question about if you intervene to help a Dalit, nobody would question your patriotic zeal or your standing as a nationalist. That
So,
wouldn't
so
happen.
you're saying that analytically that Dalits are not connected to the so-called national question, whereas Muslims are connected to the so-called
the
national
national-
question
absolutely.
because of the 20th century history of India.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Therefore, when it comes to the national question, there is a remarkable prejudice that gets expressed. So, for example, if you had supported Ishrat Jahan, my God, all hell would have broken loose.
I
right?
still don't know what hell is going to break loose when I get back.
Okay.
But
Wazira wanted to follow up.
Make a quick intervention and say that, the comparison between African American Dalits is long-standing. So, and rather to take this, I don't want to go into too much, to take up too much space with that, but just to say that, can one think about the experience of Muslims in comparison as separate, not to say one is worse off than the other.
Yeah.
It becomes sometimes, who's worse off does not necessarily mean that one community may not be experiencing forms of prejudice just because it's not as bad as, or it doesn't make it go away. And so just to move it away
no, I
from
think you're
necessary-
making a very interesting point. But this is it's a historical fact that about a community and the level of discrimination that they have suffered institutionally and they've suffered socially. Now, that's quite apparent about African Americans, and we know from history how bad that's been, and some of the greatest books and literature have been written about this. But it also is a very significant part of civil liberty in the United States of America, that people have fought for rights of blacks or American Africans. And it's the election of President Barack Obama was a very significant factor. There would equally be a very significant factor if a Dalit became Prime Minister of India. But there would be a greater significant factor if a Muslim became Prime Minister of India.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can think of that today. Dalit we can, because chief ministers are Dalits are becoming chief ministers in many places. So we can think of a Dalit becoming Prime Minister. And I think we've almost got there. Sometimes with Jagjeevan Ram and so on, we've almost got there. Speakers certainly have been Dalits. But I don't think we can think of a Muslim becoming Prime Minister yet for a very, very long time. The trouble now, of course, is that in the present structure and regime, they have to have incorporated Muslims. They have to have Muslims who are disliked by the Muslim community, but are faces that will be projected as a representation of inclusive politics. That's another complicated factor that one will have to look at in the years to come.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Khurshid, for coming here and speaking with us. My name is Umair. I originally come from Pakistan, and I'm doing my graduate studies here at Brown. You talked about illegal Muslim universities, and there's this notion that Muslims in India, they are generally thought of as being more secular as compared to Muslims in Pakistan, and most people and scholars, they draw this sort of comparative analysis. There's one school of thought that says, due to India being a secular society and nation, that has a top-down effect on how Muslims think. But I was wondering if you could say something about the teachings of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and how they are incorporated into the education system, specifically for Muslims. Whether or not that's the case, and if yes, to what extent?
See, it's curious. I don't know how much of Aligarh history you know. People often think that the advocacy of Pakistan was done in Deoband or the madrasas, etc., which is not true. Advocacy of Pakistan was done by intellectuals in Aligarh. And in fact, after partition, Aligarh was left a very desolate place because the top minds from Aligarh actually left and went to Pakistan. Sir Syed's idea obviously doesn't take into account and can't really relate to India and Pakistan. It relates to Muslims as one large community of what was known as India then. So it would apply equally to Muslims of Pakistan as it would to Muslims of India. And his idea was to bring enlightenment to Muslims, and that their subjugation and defeat in 1857 was because of their inability to use education as an instrument of advancement. But if you ask me, the situation in Aligarh today is quite the opposite of what Sir Syed wanted Aligarh to be. Aligarh has become a relatively conservative place. It was conservative even before they challenged the recent film called Aligarh, which is about differently able people. Even before that, it was a very conservative place. There is an element of extreme progressive thinking in Aligarh, which is, I guess I could say, is led by Irfan Habib. But they don't relate. They are unable to relate to the rest of Aligarh community. They are brilliant people. They are outstanding people. They are virtually worshipped in the academic circles in the world. But they mean nothing to Aligarh. They mean nothing at all because they cannot relate to an ordinary undergraduate in Aligarh. And the ordinary undergraduate in Aligarh is far more influenced today by Mulayam Singh Yadav and by Mayawati than he is by anybody else. You know, for over 25 years or 30 years, no Congress leader, top leader, meaning the president of the Congress, had visited Aligarh till 2 years ago. Mrs. Gandhi went to Aligarh for the first time in 30 years because of the hostility that Aligarh had developed towards the Congress. We used to go. We used to sometimes be received well, sometimes received in a hostile sort of way, etc. But the top leader was never able to go, and she went 2 years ago, and she was received well. But Aligarh is not what Sir Syed had dreamt Aligarh to be. Just as if you will allow me to say, that Pakistan is not what Quaid-e-Azam had said it should be when he made the first speech, which embarrasses Pakistani leaders today. And Quaid-e-Azam had said it because he obviously felt something that was noticed by none other than L.K. Advani when he visited your country. But L.K. Advani felt that and said it, and they ripped him apart, and they took away the job that he had, and he would have been India's prime minister if he hadn't praised Jinnah when he went to Pakistan. So it's a very complicated relationship on which I will hopefully say a few things on Monday.
Continuing with the comparison of Muslims in Pakistan and Muslims in India, I was wondering if there is a desire within the Indian Muslim community to sort of relate and identify with the general Islamic population around the world, sort of like there is in Pakistan. And if so, is there space available for them to demonstrate that identity, and I use this with the context of examples such as protesting against Western movies or cartoons, like the way it happens in Pakistan, and whether the result of this is some secular top-down.
Not drink Coca-Cola.
Sorry?
Not drink Coca-Cola.
Yeah. But I was wondering if that.
There is a silly element in India amongst Indian Muslims to do that. There's an organization called SIMI, Students Islamic Movement of India, which is proscribed now. There are similar small-time organizations that do that. Why they do it, I've never been able to understand. But they do propagate these kind of ideas. I think an average Muslim in India thinks very differently. Fortunately for us, when we have thought of somebody who is, in a sense, a representative of Muslim global ethos, it has been done at a time when Hindus and Muslims have unitedly done it. We did it under Gandhi with Turkey for Kemal Ataturk. We did it for the Khilafat. We did it together for Palestine under Nehru. We did it for Palestine. Under Indira Gandhi, we did it for Saddam Hussein. But it was Hindus and Muslims together who thought of them as heroes, not as Muslims alone. And this is a very interesting thing, that Palestine is the BJP government is a little more willing to reach out to the Israeli government than we were. The Congress was, but we broke ice with the Israeli government. Nevertheless, India as a whole, Hindus and Muslims, identify themselves much more with Palestine and with Arafat than they do with Netanyahu. And as far as the United States are concerned, I think most Indian families, middle class, lower middle class families, aspire to send their children to the United States of America, and I don't think they have any problem. And when India protested against the United States of America, there were equal number of Muslims and Hindus in the crowds that protested. So we don't see, much as some people try to push us as being as being part of global Islam, we don't see ourselves as part of global Islam. We seem to have a very self-contained idea of Islam in India and what we are. We are a bit self-conscious, let me say that, about Pakistan. We're a little bit self-conscious because if you do something well and we say you're doing it well, people will think that we are saying it for the wrong reason. So even when you're doing something well, we say, oh gosh, that's not very good. That's very commonplace. We see it.
We can't wear a Virat Kohli shirt.
So well, there you are. So
Yes.
At one point, I believe Professor Bharti was describing sort of a bimodal distribution of Muslim achievement in India. And I wondered, and that's something that's very curious to me, because I feel like, when you hear about India, it's like you hear about Muslims being incredibly subjugated, or you think about Shah Rukh Khan. And I guess I'm trying to understand, what are the historical reasons for that to be the case? Why do we see so few Muslims in the middle? Is it that the people who were left, is it that the Muslims that were left in India, which is like my instinct to think that were the people that were either too poor to move to Pakistan, or the ones that already had something established in India and thus had no motivation to leave? Or is there some other mechanism at play that describes that?
So I can add to that. Yeah. The migration from India, Muslim migration from India, do you see that as predominantly middle class migration, or with just a few rich Muslims who left, or a lot of rich Muslims left? Because it seemed, an implication of what she's saying is that the middle class was hollowed out because it went in large numbers to Pakistan, whereas some of the very rich Muslims actually didn't go. Is that,
Yeah.
how would you look at it?
See, I don't have figures on this, but Abu Saleh Sharif, who has his think tank here in Washington, and he's done some background papers for a review of such a committee, And one of those papers has come to a conclusion that this is not a correct position to say that Muslim community in India was truncated because of partition. They've given partition figures, and they've also said that partition took place largely in the vicinity of what is Pakistan today. So Punjab and parts of UP, etc. Whereas other places were not affected equally. In Bengal, it would have happened in parts of Bengal that was close to Sylhet and so on. It's I think the jury's out on that, but it's clear when we look at I've done some work on the residuary waqfs in our country, and I find a lot of those waqfs that actually fell into other people's hands were deserted at time of partition. People just left, those mutawallis left. Therefore, there must have been well-off people who were in charge of property or had property and then just went away and disappeared. And then, of course, the demographic change that has happened in Delhi, and the people who came to Delhi and were settled in settlement colonies, which are today now very affluent and very well-to-do colonies, are obviously lands and properties that were left behind by people who had gone. So people who were far away from the border, I think, didn't think of traveling. People who didn't suffer too much in terms of communal violence didn't travel. People who didn't have the wherewithal to be able to travel didn't travel. So there must have been a mix of middle class and lower level people who went to Pakistan. But it certainly disturbed the structure of society, and therefore society had to build again. A lot of the leaders left, and therefore it had to find leaders again. And I remember from my childhood that all well-to-do families had to get their daughters married to young men from Pakistan. Because obviously it meant the whole structure of society had gone, and we were told that people are doing much better in Pakistan, though there were subsequent narratives which suggested that people went there, got disappointed and came back, and thought that they were better off in India rather than in Pakistan. And that continued to happen for at least 20 years. It continued to happen for 20 years. So I think this is something on which some work needs to be done. And I understand I was in the Karachi Literary Festival earlier in the year, and that's a good place to research this, because everybody who was in that literary festival was from India. They kept saying, I'm from Bulandshahr, and my father was from Jabalpur, and somebody else was from somewhere. So that's the place where you just research this and find out what are the kind of people who travel. But the important thing that I found there was that there are still very strong emotional bonds that survive, and I believe that's really the future of our relationship. But we are too self-conscious to admit that those bonds exist, and we try to play them down. And it's the political people who have no past relationship with Pakistan who pretend that they are the ones who will create new bonds, whereas the old bonds that exist, I think, are being neglected.
Yeah, so this is related to the previous discussion about the victimhood between comparison of victimhood between the Muslims and the Dalits, and it came across the way you presented as if there is some kind of competitive victimhood among Muslims about Dalit issues. But when you read news, like let's say Rohit Vemula was actually raising the question of the execution of Yaqub Menun, and similarly Umar Khalid is raising the issue of tribal rights. So it comes across that among the young people there is much more like solidarity between Muslim and Dalits, right? They don't see it as like a competitive victimhood. They rather see it as a common struggle. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're right, except that these are left-wing youth, and by definition, left-wing youth have broken away from historical and conventional links that hold people down to certain constraints. They are free of those, and therefore they are in that sense unrestricted in their approach and their thinking. But the moment you get into the bulk of, and these are not people who can go and win elections, by the way. They can win a university election, but they'll have a great difficulty getting back where everyone thinks differently. Everyone thinks in terms of caste, community, upward, backward, etc., etc. They will have a great problem there. So these are people who can really be a very major resource to get people to think differently, and they will hopefully come out of university and go and do that, and hopefully will succeed. So they are in a sense more mainstream versions of Naxalites that are dealing with the problem differently through violence. These are people who will be able to try and deal with the same problem, but through their educational ability and their persuasive abilities. So I have great hope in them, and I hope that they don't burn themselves out too soon, because they can go beyond these barriers that we create for ourselves when we live in ordinary society in India. They can break those barriers or overcome those barriers, and I therefore have a great hope in them. But you know, there is a very devious enterprise, and that devious enterprise is to get Dalits and Muslims to fight. It's a very devious enterprise. Riots that happen, a lot of those riots are instigated between Dalits and Muslims, which is a frightening thing, which is a sad thing, but it's divide and rule policy quite clearly, where you lose nothing yourself, somebody else loses, but you gain in terms of control. So I think both communities have to be extremely vigilant and careful.
Thank you, sir. I have a question, a general one, about whether there is something like an Indian Muslim identity. You seem to be suggesting something like that in response to your question to Daniel. So my question is there something like that, or is there a pan-Indian Muslim sentiment that runs across, is it cut across the region, or is there a sense of isolation then within the Indian Muslim about not being able to somewhere show solidarity with the Islamic community elsewhere in the world? So how would you look at this peculiar identity here?
See, as I said, there's a fringe element that reacts to things that are happening in the world, and sometimes reacts in a strange sort of way. Sometimes it reacts to something that is done inside the mosque in Makkah, and they gather 5,000 people and start screaming, and you have to often tell them that nobody in Makkah cares about you, and nobody here cares about you. So why don't you go and do something more useful instead of deciding how namaz should be said inside Makkah? So there are these fringe guys who do this kind of thing. But whether there is a Muslim identity in the country is very difficult to say that, because a lot of people say that we are not a monolith. There are Muslims who speak Tamil and don't speak Urdu, and the idea of the Muslim identity is the Urdu-speaking North Indian Muslim is the idea of Muslim identity, but people are different. But no matter where you go deep into Kerala and you go deep into Tamil Nadu. Now, recent president was from Tamil Nadu. He was a Muslim, but Javed Akhtar has often described this as a cultural Muslim. That Javed Akhtar himself is an agnostic or an atheist, but his poetry is anything but atheist. His poetry is very Islamic in that sense, but he describes himself as a cultural Muslim. Many years ago, there is a gentleman called A.R. Sherwani who does a lot of work in education from Jeep Flashlights, and he said, my definition of a Muslim is if you hear that there's a riot in city and you begin to fear for your life, that means you're a Muslim. Now, you see, these are different ways of looking at it. But I don't think that we can say that Muslims are a monolith in across the country, and I don't think they always vote the same way. But there is some broad resonance, and commonality. So you go to a mosque in Kerala, or you go to a mosque in Azamgarh, there's a huge similarity there. There are differences, but there's also similarity. But I'm not able to say that you can pinpoint a specific identity as a Muslim identity. I think that's probably difficult to say, but there are huge resonances that you can see and feel. So you may not be able to describe it, but you certainly feel when you sit with Muslims, you can feel that this is just as Punjabi Indians, when they meet with Punjabi Pakistanis, can feel that there is something common. And when we sit there, we think, what are we doing here when these guys are talking in this language which we don't understand? So that's how it is. So there are overlaps and there are commonalities, but I don't think that there is, one can say that there's a complete identity except to the extent of their sense that they are Muslims.
Can I add to that? Just give me a minute. Would you use the term cultural Muslim for Jinnah? The Pakistan resolution by the founder of Pakistan makes an explicit argument that Islam and Hinduism are not strictly religions, but you don't have to be religious to appreciate that Indian Muslims are different from Indian Hindus. That doesn't require any recognition of religiosity per se. Culturally and civilizationally, these are two distinct communities. Would that argument be an argument on behalf of the cultural Muslim, or how would you characterize it?
See, if the trouble with that argument is that if you have a good old Kais from UP or Bihar, you would have to concede that he's culturally a Muslim, because he writes better Urdu than you, that he recites poetry better than you, that he's read all the classics that you haven't read, that he knows everything about namaz that some of you might not know, but he's not a Muslim, and he would be a cultural Muslim. There are people like Professor Narang, who was the head of the Urdu department in Jamia Millia Islamia. But he couldn't, as a senior most professor, become the vice chancellor, so he moved to Delhi University. But he's the top critic, Urdu critic in our country. I would imagine that he's culturally a Muslim, except that he doesn't say his namaz and doesn't keep rozas. But then there are many Muslims who don't do that. So what would Jinnah be? Jinnah was culturally an Englishman.
Yes.
A lot of notable analysts and scholars are of the view that in Pakistan's case, secularism as defined in terms of separation of mosque and government might not be the best approach. Perhaps secularism should be defined as the approach to make all religions equal in Pakistan. So do you think perhaps such an approach of taking a particular strand of secularism might be successful in India, and what could be the pros and cons of?
See, I'll tell you, in India, we've said that secularism means that we are not a religious society. We are a religious society, but all religions are equally respected. But you can respect all religions equally, but there will be some inherent inequality if there are 20 people of one religion and 2 people of another religion. And that's the problem. So the two sometimes start saying that you are being unfair to us because you are 20. On the other hand, the 20 can say, but look, if we are 20, you've got to accommodate with us because we also have certain rights. What the BJP has done is that the BJP has made a very strident philosophy of saying that you guys are interfering with what the 20 should have. and not actually saying that let's find some accommodation. I'll give you an example. My attitude towards beef eating is that I have felt that if a lot of people in India feel strongly that we should not be slaughtering animals and eating beef, what is wrong? Why don't we accommodate? But it's only one thing in which they feel very strongly. Why don't we accommodate? But there are some people who say, I'm sorry, I will not accommodate. I am going to have a beef party. Kerala, they said, we'll have a beef party. And we'll provoke them by saying that we're going to eat beef right in front of you. My attitude is, when you live in a country like India, why do you have to do it? Life doesn't stop if you don't eat beef. There is other things that you can eat. Then to give examples and say, but in Meghalaya they are eating beef, so why can't I eat it here? In Goa they're eating beef, so why can't I eat it here? These are inane arguments. Sometimes you have to live together and you have to find accommodation and you have to... so often our fights and these riots that he's talked about take place because during Muharram somebody throws a stone at the procession, Muharram procession, or during puja a procession goes too close to a mosque and then somebody throws something and they have a fight. When we live in a plural society, you have to adjust and to accommodate. And I don't think that makes you deny your identity in any way. It's like you're being told that there is a smoker's room, you can't smoke everywhere, but if you want to smoke, you have to go to a room and you say, I insist on smoking and blowing the smoke in your face. That's what has gone wrong with some people in our country on both sides, Muslims and Hindus, that they are insisting that they will blow smoke on the other person's face when he says this place is not for smokers.
I'm sorry, I think can we take one more? Okay, one more, thanks.
So vote bank politics in India leads to polarization of most castes at election times and most communities to different degree by different parties. You yourself mentioned cases of Dalits, Yadavas, how this has led to emergence of some Dalit leaders, Yadava leaders who walked away from fold of Congress but were able to pursue causes for their caste or communities. So there is a feeling that when it comes to Muslims, there is a polarization that is attempted by political parties this way or that way to appease them, quote unquote, or to displease them. But the leadership response from within the community has not been as vocal as in cases of Jats in Haryana, Sikhs in Punjab, Dalits in UP, and Yadavas in UP and Bihar. So point is that it seems that Muslim leadership has not responded with equal vocalness, or maybe through formation of groups or coalitions to advocate the issues that are paramount for the community. Do you share this?
Yeah, it's a difficult enterprise because if you're asking for articulation, organization, assertion, there is nobody who's done it better than Owaisi from MIM. Owaisi has been an ally of the Congress party. He voted with us throughout the tenure of UPA 2. He's now contesting elections against us. He went to Bihar and he said that he would contest 100 seats, ended up by contesting 6 seats and losing them. Because everyone said Muslims in Bihar are very sensible. They know what he's come for and what he will achieve. And even if he wins 1 or 2 seats, what is he going to get for us, etc. So they defeated him. But Owaisi is invincible in Hyderabad. You can go into old Hyderabad and put up the best candidate, but you can't make a dent in Owaisi's standing. So other people also are doing similar things, and they do it to negotiate with political parties, both before or after. In Assam, for instance, elections have just happened. There, Mr. Ajmal has his own party, AUI, UF, UDF, or whatever. He's expecting to win 25 seats, and he thinks that if he gets 25 seats, he can negotiate with the Congress and form a coalition government. This is what he thinks. Now, Congress tried very hard, very, very hard to say, don't vote for him, because if you vote for him, you're actually helping the BJP. The biggest problem now with Muslim seats where a Muslim can win for any political party is that 6 or 7 Muslim candidates now stand for that seat from various little groups. And therefore, not only is there polarization between Muslims and non-Muslims, but there's also a polarization between one kind of Muslim and another. So Muslims are the losers in that case. So if they vote strategically, as they do sometimes, they gain. But if they don't vote strategically, they become losers. And last time, in 2014, they certainly stopped voting strategically, and the result is there for anyone to see.
Okay, well, I think we're being asked to vacate the room now. So thank you very much, Mr. Khurshid. And maybe I'll take a minute just to thank my predecessor, Professor Rajiv Vora, as well, who was essential to the origins of the Year of India, which became the India Initiative, and now is moving on to its 3rd incarnation. And I should also say that on Monday there'll be another lecture at 4 p.m.
At 4 p.m.
4 p.m. in this room.
Here on India-Pakistan relations.
And thank you all for coming this afternoon.
Thank you very much.